when we have Black thought, we have to have something called argument also. On a previous show, we covered the work of Ian Rowe, and we will say more about Ian when we get into the show today. And his book that he has around agency for young people and teaching them how to get beyond the victim narrative. On the show, previous shows that we did with 8 Black Hands, we got into the concepts, and some of it we supported and some of it we didn't. And we want to have Ian on today to correct the things that we may have gotten wrong. So that's what we're going to use this Freedom Friday for, is to kind of reconcile the differences that we have so that we can move forward with strong, rigorous, scholarly African-American thought. Welcome, friends and family. It's another Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after an hour with Sharif El-Mekki and me. I don't know if that's the proper English, but I say it that way every single week. So we're going to stick with it for now. Sharif, you and I just got back from spending time in Chicago, and I want to thank you so much, brother, for always being a connector, always opening doors for me to get into places where I feel like I'm this big around people that have big brains and lots of fancy book learning, but I get to learn from them. And we were in a room with just a strong cohort of Black scholars who are producing Black scholarship. That is amazing. So I want to thank you for, number one, for us, having that opportunity, and having meet the famous James D. Anderson, who wrote the book on Black education, and Lisa Delpit, and Joyce King, and Amani Perry, amongst a whole bunch of other Black PhDs. It was amazing. So thank you.
No, listen, thank you. This is it's a community. You often talk about, like, building communities of learning. We've actually, been using your language around educational capital, right? Like hosting, building Black educator pipeline. Part of that is, like, grasping, claiming, reclaiming. It's just so much knowledge that we've produced as a people. We've produced so much knowledge and information that, if used, we'd all be better off in so many different angles. So, I can't even count the amount of doors that you've opened for me and countless other people. So to me, this is all about, like, making the world go round, like, just keep playing it forward, for all of us. So no, I was so glad you were able to come, and so grateful. As you said, I would describe it the same way for me. Just, people that inform my teaching, my pedagogical framework, my orientation, my instructional and leadership orientation so deeply, and help connect so many dots between an activist entering education and then seeing, researchers that had similar orientation and how they inform teaching and learning practices. So it was, just really, scholars. Like, I just think we have to really celebrate our scholars, learn from them, challenge them, hold them accountable, but also hold ourselves accountable for really digesting and trying to, internalize and practice, not just, oh, they've passed away, now we got their poster. Sometimes we celebrate their posters of the scholars more than we celebrate the scholars in their work. You know what I mean? We'll take a quote out of a book, and that's it. So it was just a really great opportunity. Shout out to Jarvis Givens. And then you met Jarvis Givens' teacher, the one who introduced me to him years ago.
So amazing. Yes, that's
like
amazing.
That was his high school teacher. That's like, I got somebody I want you to meet, and here he is later. Him now lifting as he climbed. Now he's helping to cultivate the next gen of Black scholarship, which is, I just loved it.
Well, that leads us into our discussion for today, which is really around, you and I have talked about this a lot, around building Black educational capital. And I think to build Black educational capital, which I mean the autonomous means of education, what we decide for ourselves should be a good conversation. or a good education, I'm sorry, for our young people, and that we own. And to be able to do that, we have to have rigorous scholarship. We have to produce knowledge. We can't just be kind of like drifters or sharecroppers in education. We have to do rigorous work. And that work, when you put it out into the world, as we saw in this last week when we talked to other scholars, is going to have lots of, there's, iron sharpens iron type of thing, right? Like, there's going to be differences of opinion. So today's guest, we're going to bring on Ian Rowe. And let's pop Ian in there. Ian Rowe actually is someone who has produced a lot of work. Ian and I have known each other for years. You, Sharif, have also known Ian. Ian and I have been in violent agreement about some things, and we've been in violent disagreement about some things. And this is
Yes.
what we should model as Black men and as Black people and as thinkers and as human beings, period, is the ability to hold really, really contrasting views on things or seeing things differently, but being able to come back to the table at some point after passions inflame and after words have been shared and whatever, to come back to the table as intellectual people and say, okay, now what's empirically true and what's
Yep.
what.
Mm.
So, Ian, welcome to the show. I want people to know who you are first. Ian Rowe is the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a new international baccalaureate high school in the Bronx. I think it's in the Bronx.
Yes.
In the Bronx. He's also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He has 10 years as CEO of Public Prep. One of the main things I like to lift up about Ian, and it's only because it's, for my own 90s affiliation as a Gen Xer, is that Ian spent time at MTV, which I think is the weirdest of the bio there, where he earned 2 public service Emmys. Now, how many of y'all listening to this can say that? So take that action, critics. Ian, welcome to the show. Good to see you, brother.
So good to see you both. I love what you just said about the need for us to be able to share agreement and share disagreement, because I do believe at the end of the day we share the same goal, and our strategies might be different, and so we just need to learn from each other about how we improve outcomes for our kids. So I'm really delighted to be on the show.
It's really funny. It's, people often say, well, I agree with Chris on some things and I don't agree on other things. And I always laugh at that. Number one, because I earn that type of calling from people when they say that. But I always wonder, are you ever around people where you agree 100% on everything? Because if you are, you're in the wrong rooms.
Correct.
Yeah,
or you're leading a very boring life.
Yes, very boring. So let's get to it. We did a show on the 8 Black Hands. We covered your work, but we did it by using an article on your work that was in the Deseret Times, I think, what it's called. And in doing that, we used their simplified version, their editorial simplified version of what it is that you're saying in the world. And you have this concept. You have a couple of concepts that you talk about. So first of all, there's your book. Your book is about agency. Then there's something that you talk about oftentimes, which is the success sequence. And I can allow you to explain more of what that is. And then there's this newer concept of F.R.E.E. That was highlighted in the article. And F.R.E.E. Is its own acronym. So I just want to give you the opportunity to say what we got wrong, because I think that's part of why we're talking today. Is you watched the show, you appreciated parts of it, but there were parts of it where you thought you guys are not representing the work in the way that you intend it to be represented.
I really appreciate it. Yeah. So again, first of all, I think it's great that you highlighted my work. I very much appreciate it, because I do think each of us comes to this work with obviously different experiences, different backgrounds, different research. You just mentioned you were in Chicago for a team of Black scholars. I would have loved to have been part of that, and I'm wondering what the criteria was for selection, because those kind of rooms could be unbelievable for certainly someone like me or colleagues who are interested in this work to interact with. It sounds like an incredible body of people that you were with. So the very fact that we're having this discussion, and I just discovered that point, is already an opportunity for us to say, let's break down these walls that seem to be self-erected, right? And break through. So in terms of the discussion, I thought there were lots of points of agreement, but I did think there were opportunities for clarification. And would it be helpful for me to talk a little bit about why I wrote agency and some of the key points I'm trying to bring forward?
I think that would be a great starting point. So you spent, and I knew while you were writing this book that you were working on it. So I didn't know all the background. What actually prompted you to write that book? What was the start of that work?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was on your show, gosh, a couple years ago, and we did have a couple of discussions about the success sequence. And it was actually partly as a result of some of those discussions that I started to change my frame even around the success sequence and the need for something broader, which is why the F.R.E.E. framework really emerged, and I can talk about that. But the principal reason why I wrote the book is that, just like the two of you, we've both been in this work trying to figure out what are the right strategies for Black kids. I mean, I run schools in the heart of the South Bronx, and yes, prior to that, MTV and the White House and these interesting vantage points. But something that has occurred over the last few years in particular have been what I call these two kind of big meta narratives, which in my view are impeding the ability of our young people, our Black kids, to really see a future for themselves. Not all Black kids, but in certain communities for sure. And these two meta narratives I describe as blame the system, and the other I call blame the victim. In the blame the system narrative, that's an ideology that basically posits that if you're not successful in this country, it's because the country itself is rigged against you, right? It's inherently oppressive based on your race, your class, your gender identity, and that these systems are so rigged, so overwhelming, so discriminatory, so powerful that in a sense you're almost powerless unless there are these other systems that have to come into play, whether it be reparations or top-down decisions like removing standards and other things, which we can talk about. But in a blame the system ideology, that basically paints the country as the enemy of your dreams. And for a young person, that's obviously can be a very debilitating message. And I can talk about specific examples that I think bring that to light. But on the other side, and this is one of the things that I think I wrote to you about, is this other narrative, this other meta narrative that I call blame the victim. And in that ideology, if you're not successful in this country, it's not because America is the problem. America's a land of opportunity. America's great. America's, cleansed of any of its past. You're the problem if you are not successful, right? Like you didn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You haven't taken advantage of all the opportunities that exist in this wonderful country, right? And so the issue with that narrative is that, it's really hard to pull yourself up in your own bootstraps, depending on where you are born, the conditions of your family, a whole bunch of factors. So we have to give grace to young people or anyone when we're saying blame the victim and we're not acknowledging the conditions that exist that made it much harder for you to succeed. And so these two meta narratives to me add up to a singular lie, right? That basically send the message to our young people. It's like either you got no shot because the system's rigged against you, or it's your fault for not being successful. And that's just a false dichotomy. Now, there are grains of truth in each one. Like I run schools in the Bronx, right? So in terms of like in where we just launched our high school in District 12 in the Bronx, of the 2,000 or so kids that started ninth grade in 2015, 4 years later, only 7% graduated from high school ready for college. Meaning that they started ninth grade and either dropped out somewhere along the way, or they did earn their high school diploma, but still can't do math nor reading without remediation if they were to go to college, right? Now, in this district, there is a cap. We're fighting with the governor's got on our on our side. We're fighting in Albany right now to try and get a cap lifted on charter schools. Because if you wanted to launch a new charter school in this area to bring a better opportunity to 93% of the kids, that are not graduating, ready for college, you couldn't do it because of this legislative barrier. That is an example of a real systemic barrier, right? A 7-year-old can't solve that problem. So we have to be able to both acknowledge, even in these meta-narratives, the grains of truth, right? While still saying we can empower our young people to understand the strategies that they do have within their quiver. And that's why I felt it was important not to just shout in the rain about these two narratives, what are we going to do, but to say, okay, well, Ian, what's your empowering alternative? What are you putting forth to say, what can I put in the hands of young people? And so that's where I developed this concept of agency as being the thing that I think if we can cultivate a new age of agency, it doesn't mean that we don't continue to fight the systemic barriers and everything else, but we can articulate a set of pillars and a strategy to empower our young people. And again, I'm happy to talk about agency, the success sequence, how I've even morphed on that, and the F.R.E.E. framework. Was that helpful? Oh, Chris, you're muted.
And I was saying amazing things too. So that's very helpful. So let me offer just a piece of like a reaction on one thing. It's only 1 point. So all of what you said, I could basically agree with so much of that. But there's this thing that gets to me about this victimhood narrative, describing the victimhood narrative, that it might be actually sweeping in valid, empirically studied claims of systemic discrimination that takes place whether you want it to or not, or whether you observe it or not. It sweeps all of that into this bucket of you're just thinking like a victim. So that's a very bothering point, number one. The second point is, do we have evidence that there are any Black people anywhere teaching their kids that the system is so rigged that you shouldn't even try? Because what to me seems more like the Black folklore, the foundational Black folklore has always been you have to work twice as hard. What I heard from my parents and in my community was, even if you're going to be a street sweeper, be the best street sweeper. It was never the system is so bad that you should just not even try, or that you should not be excellent. As a matter of fact, the Black church folklore, the Black non-church folklore, the Black power movement of the 70s, all of it was about recognizing wherever there are barriers and blowing through them, like passing them. We celebrated, as a matter of fact. And if, people who read Jet magazine for years and years and years, which it seems like almost every Black household did, I recently, and Sharif knows this, I recently went back and got the Jet magazine for my birthday, the day that I was born, just to see what the world was talking about, what Black world was talking about on the day I was born. And it was interesting to see that Jet had so much celebration of people moving up. It was a total upward mobility framework for thinking of things. And I remember being a kid thinking about all these fancy Black people that were busting through barriers. It wasn't a pity party. It wasn't like, oh, more people are being lynched or more people are being discriminated against or any of that stuff. It was really, there's discrimination in the world, but look at this dude who's rising up in Pepsi Cola. Look at this, these executives that are breaking barriers and whatnot. So I just want to offer that point, because that's a point that makes me a little more emotional, because it feels like we're miscasting what Black people actually think and say to their kids.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. I mean, I write about this in the book that I'll give you an example of someone who I think you've interacted with, who creates this persona of the sort of futility of Black endeavor, Nicole Hannah Jones, and it's not only her. It's not only her, but let's choose the racial wealth gap as probably one of the most cited pieces of data that's real, right? That shows that there is a significant difference between the average wealth of the average Black family and the average white family, and it has to do with historical reasons, contemporary reasons. And it is true, if you look at the 2019 survey of consumer finances, if you look at that data, it says purely, and I don't think anyone disputes this, the wealth of the average white family is about $160,000 more than the wealth of the average Black family. It's irrefutable. So that's an example of what you're saying. It's like empirical, studied, evidentiary piece of information. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, she wrote an 8,000-word essay a couple years ago called "What is Owed?" And basically, it was her treatise on basically saying that this isn't by accident. This is part of a deliberate outcome for this country, both historical and present day, of putting Black people in its place. And there's no other solution but, in her view, sort of a $14 trillion reparations program. But in the article, she says, and I'm quoting here, it doesn't matter what a Black person does. Doesn't matter if you get married, doesn't matter if you buy a home, doesn't matter if you get college educated, doesn't matter if you save. None of those things, in her view, can overcome, quote, 400 years of racialized plundering, end quote. Right. Now, first thing, it's important to note that Nicole Hannah-Jones has done all four of those things in her own life, right? And so good for her, because she's leading a quite prosperous life. But that message, in my view, is sending a message of futility. It's almost like you're saying you're inherently a victim, because it doesn't matter what you do. And again, I can get you the exact quote, but I'm not off by much. I'm not off by much. And that message was embedded in the curriculum of the New York Times 1619 Project. So and of course, the kicker to all of this is in that same data, the 2019 survey of consumer finances, you will find accurately this difference of $160,000 if you look at race alone. But if you take into account just two factors, family structure and education level, and yes, I agree, this is not exactly apples to apples. However, the wealth of the average Black married college educated family is about $160,000 more than the wealth of the average white single parent family. So the thing for me with the blame the victim, so what that indicates is that perhaps there are factors outside of race where, if a young person understands what those levers are, they can have a dramatically different outcome for their individual life. And so the thing that I'm trying to bring out is that you can't dispute or ignore these racial differences on a number of dimensions, right? Poverty, incarceration, educational outcomes, they exist and they're real. So you'll never hear me saying the disparities don't exist. What I'm trying to bring about is, what are the tools, as we're fighting those structural disparities and all of those efforts, what are the tools we can put in the hands of young people that can learn from others who've been in those same exact situations, and not view themselves as victims per se, and said, hold on, there are a set of strategies I can deploy in my own life.
Sharif, I want to bring you in on this point, but I can't say enough about how much of a allergic reaction I have to framing these things as teaching kids about being victims. I literally do not think that Black people or Black youth think of themselves in those terms. I think that's what white people say about what Black people think. But I think young Black people are braggadocious. I believe they are bold. I believe that they think that they're going to make something out of nothing. I think that they listen to music that tells them, I'm going to be a mogul one day. I'm going to own the world. I'm going to be Jay-Z. Sometimes to a point where it's going too far in the other direction of I'm going to play in the NBA, right? Like, I think we have Black young people who dream big and don't think that they are victims. I just think that that's words that I wish we could take it out of the debate fully, because it does so much to cheapen, number one, what Black people really feel about themselves and think, but also to just cheapen the discussion, because the whole victimhood thing is not words we introduced to the debate.
That's interesting. And just for what it's worth, in my school, we are never saying you're, Invictus is, Invictus is one of the poems that we're going to have all of our kids be able to learn and recite, because oral recitation of poetry is, I think, a very powerful teaching vehicle. But the last two lines of that poem are, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." So it's really, to your point, it's really not so much saying you're not a victim, as opposed to saying you have control over your destiny. So it's trying to shift what is often viewed as sort of a deficit-based thinking to an asset-focused thinking. So know that when we're trying to interact with our kids, the message we're saying is you can, not that no. It's not that you can't. It's here's what you have the power to achieve. And so for so many of the kids, even the braggadocious ones that you're talking about, they might say it, but they don't necessarily know what the best tools are to get there.
But I think that framing changes my feeling about the debate.
Mm.
The way you just said that changes. When I hear that you're thinking like a victim thing, number one, I don't think that it actually involves real Black people for what they really think. I just think that that's someone else's perception of how we're seeing the world. But this thing that you just said, there's no disagreement with me. I feel like there's kids that are aspiring to do things, but they don't know all of the steps to get there. For instance, the kid that think that they're going to be in the NBA doesn't know how to get in the NBA,
Yeah.
right? Or they don't know what the statistics on that actually are oftentimes.
Or they never
No.
even think, can I be the owner of that NBA team?
Absolutely. Or
Right?
what it takes to become the owner of the
Right.
team,
Right.
or to get to that point. So Sharif, I want to bring you in, bro. I feel like, Ian and I can go back and forth on these things forever. So
No.
bring you
This
in,
is
bro.
this is riveting. This is
Uh,
really riveting. I think I agree. I was also thinking about the amount of just I started my career in middle school, and like the number of middle school kids who are like, oh yeah, I'm conquering the world, and from whatever angle that they that they felt. I all of this, and Ian and I have spoken about this a lot. I think that the system doesn't bear as much of the attention. I was glad to hear you talk about system, because in the past it sounded like sometimes you were giving them a full reprieve and focusing on Black people or Black community. When I as a principal, we would always talk to our students about having yes, there's hard work to be done. The quote that probably every Black family has heard this or taught their kids, the quote that about working twice as hard to get half as far. um, what I would see often are educators and policymakers and other adults telling students not only what they can't do, but not giving them the tool. Part of like not knowing the tools is because so many things are stacked up against them, right? Like so many of the tool. If I'm in a school that's underfunded, disinvested, and I'm this third grader, which we know is like one of the most critical grades,
Yep.
what exactly is the tool? Like, what am I supposed? Like, what does my self determination look like if I'm not being taught the science of reading? Because some other folks are just deciding that uh, it doesn't matter what the research says. We're just going to keep raking in the
mhm.
millions on this. Like, what exactly does self determination look like for that child? And even for some people, like, well, that's the family. Even the family, right? Because part of this whole American thing, and I think you and I had spoken about this before. Some of it is this idea of trusting the institutions to do things, which institutions are full of adults and policies that they create.
Yep.
Where what I mean, like the onus. Yes, I'm all about like Malcolm would say, like, yeah, we have to pull ourselves up, and we're going to give blistering feedback to systems and attempt to change that as well. But at the same time, he was also telling the district, give us 30% of the schools and return them to the community, because you don't know what you're doing and you are undermining
Mhm.
our students' brilliance, right? Like for him to say that, and at the same time, like, hey, put that wine bottle down, you know what I mean? And like it's a combination of things. And I feel like sometimes in this conversation, and particularly folks who use the materials of victimhood and like what they and while you may say like, hey, I'm not excusing the system, I do believe, and we see evidence of this in think pieces and think tanks, from thought pieces to think tanks, who will use that kind of language to release the system and basically jail, condemn, the people. And so, like,
Yeah.
to me, that's the challenge, and being like super clear about that, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, I feel like, Ian, and, I don't know if you want to speak to that point. It's just that there are people who will glam on to that part of the work, of your work, in my mind, because they think it excuses the other conversations. And even when I hear you say, we can't teach our kids that everything is about race. One, I don't think we teach our kids that everything is about race. We teach them that the things that are about race are about race. Like smart Black people teach their kids, like Adam, to name things what they actually are. God gave you the power to name things actually what they are. Now, I think some people get it wrong. And this is what I'm sure you would say. Like, they name too many things.
Yep.
They
Yep.
start
Yep.
handing out racism certificates in every direction. You get a racism certificate. You get
You
one. You
get
get
right,
one.
right,
Yeah. And people would claim that that's what I do. I actually feel like I'm a little bit, in my own defense, a little bit more clinical than that. I call racist things racist. I call bigoted things bigoted. There's a name for things, right? But I think there are people that would say, why do we have to focus on any of that? Why can't we just focus on this thing that makes me feel comfortable?
right.
And that would be missing the point, because some of those things that we wouldn't talk about do cause us problems. They do cause harm, and they cause us problems.
Yeah.
And
I
Ian, just Nicole Hannah Jones, that just a question: was she saying that even if you have those things, you will still experience racism? Because anti-blackness, being rich won't save you from anti-blackness, right? You just might be in a different orbit, a different stratosphere. Doesn't mean that there's not anti-blackness in rarefied
I
air. It's
look,
probably even more intense in some of those
look.
spaces. So I'm just wondering if she's saying, like, even if you do those things, you will still experience anti-blackness.
No, no, no.
Um,
She
okay.
wasn't making that point. And I don't make that point either. I mean, we can all talk about people that we know personally who may be in higher echelons, who are Black, people of color, who definitely have their own stories of racism. It's just that, they bring themselves to sleep in their jacuzzi instead of but I mean, the point being that class alone does not rid humanity of racism. So, and the truth of the matter is, I don't know what will. For me, in running schools, what I just want to put our young people in a position that they have choices. That at the end of the day, there might be a person who dislikes them because of their race or has some level of power, but generally they have the freedom and flexibility to make the choices in their life. That's where I want to get to. But to your point, like, we have to be able to figure out how to move um, in two parallel paths at the same time. The first path is addressing where we do see structural barriers that are clearly harmful to the aspirations of our children. And I just mentioned one because we are literally in the fight in New York State right now, because just to give you some detail, in New York State, there's something like 420 or so charters. But the way that the access to those charters is distributed is based on region. So there are about 100 left that we could open 100 great schools. But in New York City, there's a regional cap, literally, partly because of Bill de Blasio and some of the past leadership. New York City has reached its proportion of the legislative cap. So you can't launch a new school. So Governor Hochul has pitched to eliminate the regional cap. The day after she announced it, a lot of leadership of a political party, and by the way, of multiple hues, let me say, said, and, and let me just say,
Yeah.
they said that would crush, I think they used these words, crush the public school system in New York. Just like, dude, so again, we have to fight that kind of madness, because it is so obvious that that is one of many examples of real structural barriers that are hurting our kids. We have to be able to go in that direction and let young people know. So, for example, so I obviously talk about family structure a lot, and I think maybe even Chris, you even come after me on some of these. Like, I talk about what's happening in families, particularly in Black families, but the truth is, you know, it's across race at this point, where I feel the strength of the family is one of the biggest tools that we have as Black people, as all people. And yet we have very high rates of non-marital birth rates. That's not blaming the victim. That's just, you know, that's just trying to state um, a piece of data where if we are able to make that a collective priority amongst us, that could help to address some of the issues in our community while still rapidly fighting against the structural barriers. So I think I'm with you both. And it is a slippery slope, I guess, once you start talking about anything connected to personal responsibility or accountability or things like family structure. It's very easy for people to say, "Oh, wait, he's, you know, he's blaming the victim. You know, he's blaming us for our own challenges." So I acknowledge that that is a slippery slope, and you know, I'd love advice on how to
I'll give you
balance
some.
that.
So I got some.
So as always, this is about terms and about how you frame things. I don't think that the problem with talking about personal responsibility is that you get into a trap of blaming the victim. I believe it's because you get in a trap of ignoring the personal responsibility that people are taking every day. And you and I actually look at the same situation and agree on it. And where our disagreement comes is in characterization of the problem and characterization of it and what we focus on. I actually am on a full-time ministry of talking about Black fatherhood specifically as its own thing, and Black fellowship around Black fatherhood, and about good fathering, and about fathering that goes beyond race, like what we do for our children that's just about being men and
Yeah.
just about being dads. And that's whether you are, you know, you have beige children like my own, or whether you have Black children or whatnot, you are still a Black father who is showing up that has to figure some things out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that, like, you know, you may not love this or whatever, but every time I put out something like this, it's really interesting to me that Dove soap is one of the first ones to retweet me, because they have this fatherhood project, this Black fatherhood project with Sean Dove and others.
Oh,
The
okay.
people who I believe are leading on this issue are taking it from a positive frame. They're not starting from a deficit. They're not calling us bad fathers. They're not ignoring the good fathers, the good Black fathers in the world, whether we are married or not, whether we are within marital bonds or not. What I know and experience that white America doesn't know about us is that there are a lot of Black men showing up doing fathering every day, whether they're married or not, whether their children were born while they were married or not, or whether they got married later, or whether they're stepfathers, or whether they are fathering in so many ways. Charles Cole talks a lot about this in his own life. How many Black men, coaches, preachers,
Yep.
pastors, or whatever. This is the thing about, like, when you talk about kids who grow up in church having better academic outcomes, one of the reasons why is because they are exposed to intergenerational mentorship through different leaders. They get to see different models of people within that church. So this emphasis, I think that there's a spirit that loves to beat Black people up around things like family structure and you're not doing enough and deficit. And if you would just get your act together, or you would just, that's all punitive and retributive language that actually isn't about making a people better or pushing them forward, because you don't push a people forward by criticizing them into oblivion. You push them forward by lifting up the examples of what
Yep.
actually the model actually should be and is. So on this one, this is one where you are in violent agreement about the importance of the issue. You and I have had this conversation before. We talked a while ago about something around like a community responsibility project,
Yep.
like a project that really, but our paths would be different to getting there, because my social media feeds, my Facebook feeds are full of Black dads putting up pictures of their babies, their graduations, their failures, their hopes, their dreams, their look what happened to me this weekend, all of that. So for me, it's very visible to see something that I don't think that we're seeing when we talk about this issue, and we should. which is why one of my campaigns is make Black fathers visible,
Right.
especially make good Black fathers visible. We are 3 Black men here right now who are all fathers. And I don't know how much of a part of our public identity that actually is. I mean,
It's interesting. So you will be, I think you'll be very interested to know, on April 25th, I will be debating Richard Reeves, who you may know is, I think, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And he's just written a book called Of Boys and Men. And it's gaining a lot of traction because he's done, I think, a pretty good job in laying out the case of what has happened to boys across race, but in particular Black boys. And I don't know if you've read the book, but he's made the case of how Black boys and boys in general are receding in terms of college admissions, college presence, degrees, suicide rates, overrepresented, more fatherlessness. And so but his prescription, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about this. His prescription is that he thinks we need to now start teaching the next generation, the rising generation, how they think about how to form their own families. Is that he wants to create fatherhood as an institution divorced from marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, dude, if I tell my 14-year-old boys in 9th grade, they'll be bet I'm all down to fatherhood. So we're going to have a debate. And he'll be debating, making the case that fatherhood should be its institution independent of marriage. And I'm going to be debating that marriage is the institution that strengthens fatherhood. So again, is there a way to draw a distinction between fathers today of any family structure who may be doing the right thing versus what we're teaching the rising generation around the kinds of structures that are more likely to lead to success for themselves and their future children? Because I think it's an important distinction. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, and that's one.
I do, but I don't.
That's
know.
one of the reasons the success sequence is one of the tools in my.
Well, tell people what that is, because we didn't get to that. Tell people what the success sequence is.
And can you also share? You said from the success sequence, you modified it, into after some conversations. I would also love to hear the audience. Like, what was the prick in your consciousness that said, like, okay, this needs to evolve?
Necessary but not sufficient. That's kind of So the success sequence, and this, again, for what it's worth, I ran public prep from 2010 to 2020, but it was in 2016 I had this sort of epiphany moment where I saw the Who's Your Daddy truck in the Bronx, which is a mobile DNA testing center. And it just really struck me in a whole new way that, in this particular section of the Bronx, the non-marital birth rate was 84%. And it's not that running schools, you don't know that many of our kids are in challenging family situations, but there was something about seeing the normalcy of that truck, and that, low-income folks are spending like between $350 and $500 to get DNA paternity tests to answer questions like, could you be my sister, or are you my father? And like VH1, I mean, I was at MTV many years ago. VH1 did a reality show called Swab Stories on the truck. Is Julia going to find out if her boyfriend is actually her brother? Like crazy, like what became entertainment, right? And so anyway, that whole experience, because I used to think I just need to focus on great schools, and so it forced me to think differently about all the things we needed to teach the rising generation outside of just great math and science and all that. But what should we talk about? Things like family formation. And it was in the process of doing that research to kind of figure out what could I be doing in our schools that I discovered this concept of the success sequence. And it's pretty straightforward. It's kind of common sense. Some people criticize it, saying that it's you're almost like pre-choosing the people who do it. But I think it's pretty valid. Anyway, so if you finish just your high school degree, then get a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work. And then if you have children, if you got married first, 97% of millennials who pursue that series of decisions, education, work, marriage, and children, 97% avoid poverty. It's not 100%. There's no guarantees in life, and the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond, but it's pretty overwhelming. And in the Black community, I think the data is like 91%, right? So, if you look at completely separate data in the Black community, the poverty rate amongst Black married couples has been in the single digits, like 7%, 8% for like 30 plus years, right? So, so it's a piece of data that was discovered, many years ago, and it's kind of common sense, right? But and so we started actually teaching it in our schools, and we had enormous pushback, right? Enormous pushback. First of all, many of our kids, their parents didn't follow the success sequence in their own lives, and if you start teaching this, you'll be making these kids feel bad about their own families. You'll be demonizing them. Even the term success sequence indicates that there's only one pathway to success. And I do remember doing your show, Chris, and we talked about some of these things. And so I started to think about, well, could these criticisms be right? Could these criticisms be legit? And if so, is there a better way? Because I don't think the behaviors that we're trying to advocate for are wrong, but the ways in which we speak about it could be wrong or turn people off. So one of the first things we did was to meet with, at that time it was 8th grade, meet with 8th grade parents to ask them, like, you've entered our charter school, not only because you wanted us to teach about math and reading and science, but also because you wanted us to teach your kids about those behaviors that give them the best chance of success. And we're thinking about teaching this thing called the success sequence, and we talked about the behaviors. And what was really interesting was that the feedback we got from parents was, thank God someone is teaching my kids about these things, but you've got to be really careful how you talk about it, right? Because I don't want, Julia coming home and saying, Mom, you got it all wrong, right? So we changed the term. So now pathways to power. So we don't use the term success sequence in our schools. Like, for example, so our class around this is called Pathways to Power, because it's all about empowering our students to know the behaviors that give them a better chance than data says otherwise. And even in the class, we teach this data in what we call a descriptive fashion, not a prescriptive fashion. Meaning we say, look, you're now in high school, because this is now for our high school, so in 9th grade. In the next 8 to 10 years of your life, you're going to be making big decisions about your education, your relationships, your work. You just are. So we want to make sure you know that there's actually data that says if you make decisions in this path, 97% of people who follow this end up in this set of outcomes. Here's another set of outcomes that may be more or less, or here's another set of outcomes. But the key message is you choose. You choose. You're the architect of your own life, right? And that, for me, is the best we can do. So it's not the success sequence. In the world, I talk about the success sequence because that's what the data is typically associated with that term. But in our schools, pathways to power and these sort of alternative strategies where young people learn the information, which hopefully will equip them with the decision-making capabilities of what they decide to do in their own life. So that's the first thing about that. And let me just quickly say, the other thing that became clear to me about the success sequence is that it's a framework for economic decision making, in the sense of it lacks a moral dimension. And the more and more, because even when I started writing my book, Agency was principally going to be about the success sequence and pathways to power and all this. And I started to realize I was completely missing the role of faith in how, even though religiosity is in decline in our country and young people in particular, the data is overwhelming. When you look at young people who do have a personal faith commitment, dramatically different outcomes in terms of depression, social isolation, all these things. And so I really start to step back and say family is definitely important. That's why it's the first letter in F.R.E.E. But I really started to think, the success sequence necessary but not sufficient, because I'm not doing enough justice to what the role of faith could be in more young people. So that's why I started to evolve, not just focusing on the success sequence. So if you look at my book, success sequence is now actually only a tool within the family pillar. But F.R.E.E. talks about this larger framework.
So talk about F.R.E.E. So first of all, too, I don't want to run out of time to get to anything else that you feel like we did not get right in our previous talk about these things. But if you want to quickly tell people, so F.R.E.E. is the acronym of which of 4 concepts that you talk about that we covered in the 8 Black Hands show.
Yeah.
And I feel like, if my memory serves me right, the one that I think got to me, the first 2 were super strong. Right. Family and religion, I think, no problem with me at all. Like you and I have had this conversation before, and I think we underestimate the power of children going to church, not just once a week, but twice a week. You and I have talked about the data in the past of the ones that go Wednesday and Sunday, actually, the trajectory of your life changes, just period. And if people want a different show for that, we can have a different show for that, and I'll fight anybody on that one.
We should. We don't talk about it enough.
No, and the family one, you and I are aligned on the family one. It's just how we conceive of how we create a positive Black family model, like how we talk about a positive, instead of talking about the deficit, instead of talking about what's missing, how we talk about where we should go. But it's the next 2 that really, for me, first of all, education was one of those. And in the article that we read, it primarily talks about school choice as your thing. And the critique I had pushback, which may not have been fair because it came from the article, which was, you have run schools before, you know that the education module of your concept should be way more than school choice, because school choice will not fix bad teaching, bad preparation of teachers, bad curriculum, bad scope, sequence, budgeting, governance. Like, we could keep going down the line of things of what it takes to run good schools. And school choice ain't fixing none of those things. Like, school choice is not going to fix the way that we prepare teachers to teach. That's just, we can have all the school choice in the world. Florida's proof of this, the most choicey state in the world, and we're still producing teachers that get to the classroom and don't know what they're doing, right? So there's that one. And then the last one was entrepreneurship, which I don't want to go deep. I want to go deeper a little on the education piece to see what you think about that. The entrepreneurship one, I was just like, listen, everybody's auntie and uncle thinks they're an entrepreneur, right? Everybody got a side hustle. Like, Black people are not lacking businesses. Like, we are the micro business kings and queens of the world. So the entrepreneurship to me feels like a throwaway one in some ways, because no, let me take that back. Maybe the thing with entrepreneurship is we just need to do it better, or we need to know more about how to do it right, whatever. But let's stick with education first. Was it unfair of me to go after the fact that the article said that and actually, when I went to your page on American Enterprise Institute, most of the education part of the F.R.E.E. stuff is about choice. It's not about how you run great schools.
Oh, well, then I need to fix that.
Yeah, I mean, it was mostly all choice was in the education part of the
Oh, that's interesting. Well, okay, well, then I definitely need to fix that. So, so absolutely. So school choice, like so many of these things, necessary but not sufficient. So, Sharif, you even talked earlier about the science of reading, and many of us are having this epiphany over the last couple of years. We've been teaching reading wrong, or incorrectly.
Black folks for many years were not. I'd love for you to highlight that. And Black folks were actually not teaching it incorrectly. And many of them in the professional world were forced to change. And many of them went there fighting and screaming. So
so that's interesting. I would love to know.
Tangential point, but just want to where those arguments started about going to whole language did not come from the Black community.
Not Black educators.
Yeah, well, we should write about that more.
Yeah, who wanted to stick with phonics, as a matter of fact.
Because even with all the discussion about the science of reading that has occurred over the last year or two, the vast majority of elementary schools are still baked in the whole balanced literacy frame. So, but anyway, that is something I cover. So yes, your criticism, which seemed to focus on school choice as being, my singular recommendation, in my view, didn't reflect all the things that I had talked about in that section of my book, because I do think it's meaty, and one would hope coming from someone who's run schools. But certainly school choice, and school choice in all of its flavors, charters, vouchers. I generally think the more that we put power in the hands of parents to make the choice. I mean, a couple of years ago, I wasn't happy with my own school's kids from my elementary school here during COVID, and we partnered with 5 other families to create a little pod. And for a year, we hired our own teacher, and it was an amazing year. We're now back in our public school system. I ran for school board, so now I'm on the school board. But the point is that I appreciated that fact that I at least had the privilege to be able to make that choice. Not all families are. So I do think school choice should be the anchor for anyone legitimately concerned with getting better outcomes for kids. But if that's your only anchor, it's wholly insufficient. The other things I talk about.
Well, wait a second. Let's just stop on that one for a second.
Okay.
I really want to ask you this question about that one, though. Isn't the anchor really strong instruction? Isn't
Well,
that the root of all roots?
Well, I want to get there because yes, but in the real world, we're not going to get to strong instruction for everybody right away. So if you're in a neighborhood in the Bronx where there's strong instruction at school A but not yet at school B, I want the ability to go to school A, right? So it again, choice between lots of bad options doesn't move the needle. But like in New York City, there are neighborhoods where we literally, and in fact, even in the same building, we'll be in a school building, maybe a co-location where you might have and I won't say every charter school is great, but in many instances in the same building, a high-performing charter school with a traditional district school, where you might have differences of 50 to 60 percentage points of proficiency. And a parent doesn't have the ability to send their kid to that same charter school. That's just fundamentally wrong, right? But again, to your point, necessary but not sufficient, because if your only choices are bad, choice doesn't help. Now, along the school choice dimension, I also write about what, in my view, again, some people think this is controversial, but I think we should be doing more and more to get more religious schools to run schools as options for a parent. So if you look at like the growth in Catholic schools over the last few years, many of our parents want that option, and so to the degree that, and this current Supreme Court composition is actually allowing, like, schools in Maine that used to be, like, Maine, because of it's a rural state, allowed vouchers to be used, but they disallowed a parent from being able to use that voucher at a religious school, even if it was close to them. And the Supreme Court said, you know what? If a state is allowing you to have a voucher to choose your school, it has to allow the choice of religious schools too. So I do think those kinds of things are important. So that's another piece of my education platform. Again, not everyone agrees with that, but for me, we should be, and I think you've even written about this, education pluralism. We should be less interested in dictating the structure of a school if that's what a parent believes is right for these kids, and that by design introduces schools that some people would say, wait, how could you allow that? But if you want to be free, we have to truly be free and let parents choose what they think is the right thing for their kid. So religious schools. I also, in the book, I talk about the importance of the science of reading. I mean, I'm an E.D. Hirsch guy. Years ago, I read Dictionary of Cultural Literacy even before I was running schools, and like, it spoke to me, that this idea that there is a body of knowledge, regardless. Any culture has a set of information that is presumed. And if we're not teaching that to our kids in some deliberate fashion, they're always going to be on the outside. And that's so. And actually, there's just been a study just released actually in the last couple of days about a longitudinal study on core knowledge, the curriculum that came out of the cultural literacy book, that shows demonstrably higher outcomes in reading proficiency. I encourage all your listeners to read it, but I think that's fundamental. I tweeted
about it this morning. I tweeted about that study.
Oh,
need to
okay.
find it. I haven't
with
seen that.
yeah, I
Presumed
tweeted
by
about it this
who is the
morning,
thing.
but here's what I tweeted about it with all the snark that's characteristic of me, right?
Okay.
This is what I tweeted about it. It's amazing that the study shows that there's an evidence-based link between core knowledge or a knowledge-rich curriculum and outcomes for kids. And the people who are going to study or who are going to pass this study around and claim victory with it are not running their campaigns on that. They're running their campaigns on culture war items that have nothing to do with
Well,
strong
yeah.
teaching, learning, instruction, curriculum, scope, sequence, budget, governance, data usage, outcomes. All of those things are nonpartisan and science-based and whatever. And if everybody would just lead with those instead about all these other things that are meant to be divisive, like how bad can we hate this one group of people or hate this other group of people or tell this one group they can't do a thing or whatnot. Totally un-American in terms of a portfolio of things to talk about with the public, while you're ignoring there used to be a sensible centrist middle group of people that were adults when the adults were in the room on education policy who could talk about how are we preparing our teachers? How are we using data? How do we know what we're saying works? What's the, we now have quality blind education agendas on both sides of the aisle. Quality blind, just a free for all. Build as many things. Let's let everybody run a school in a basement underneath a thing or whatever. Let's throw all data out of the water. Let's not have any accountability. Let's not talk about the thing that every school leader knows, which is managing an education, like a building, an education institution, is not about any of this stuff we're talking about nationally.
Well, that's for sure.
It's not about any of this stuff we're talking about. Like there's not a single principal or school leader in America who's going to be helped by the education discussion we're having.
No, it's true. But in particular, your point about instruction. I mean, the truth is, I will confess, I didn't really go after instruction as much as I probably should have in my book. But I'll ask you, how do we tackle schools of education in particular? Because they remain the primary vehicle through which we're getting most of our teachers.
I mean, my first response to that would be is like, why aren't we talking about it?
Well,
why are we talking about all this other stuff? Why haven't smart people pulled together to explain to the public what the problem actually is there? Like, listen, public, you need to understand where your teachers come from and how they're being prepared or not being prepared. Even Sharif has said this a lot. Like, Sharif, what's the statistic on the number of new teachers that say that they were not prepared at all for teaching?
Over half, 60-something% are not prepared. And then if the students are culturally different in any way, which also speaks to preparation, it's 72-75%. And this has been consistent. I saw some very similar data back in 2012 when I was at the U.S. Department of Ed.
I think it's shocking that we're not talking about that. The fact that 70% of teachers themselves say that their programs prepare them.
It's crazy.
And even with the culture piece, right? Like, with everyone. So one, bias didn't come out of CRT. It didn't come out of Black studies. It didn't come out of Black history. Bias is a psychological term. And back to teaching and learning, having some biases is actually good. Like we don't like, as human beings, we don't like animals
sauerkraut.
Sauerkraut.
I hate sauerkraut. I have a bias against sauerkraut. Can't stand it.
Yeah, I see you ain't say that in Chicago.
I didn't say that in Chicago.
They'll chase you. You know what I mean? But like, sharp fangs that come out at night, you know what I mean? Like we want to avoid them. That's a healthy bias, right? But also understanding that bias, when we talk about like the fundamentals of teaching and learning, students' relationships, they matter, and they matter a whole lot. Students being able to access prior knowledge, meaning making a connection between whatever you're teaching and something that they've learned before is absolutely critical. Teaching something that's actually relevant, where students see relevance to them now and or in their future, absolutely critical for them to dive into and learn it, right? Like, and so all of that now is like, bias. Oh, we want to ban the term bias. Not understand that it's a psychological term, you idiot, right? Like, so this is what
it's a science term.
Yeah,
sure. Sharif, the new organization, I guess not so new anymore, but the new organization that you created to recruit Black male teachers, are most of those folks coming from schools of education, or they're coming from work experience, or like where are they mostly coming from?
It's a variety. So most of it is with high school students. So we start with that in college youth. All the college youth are not ed majors, and the ones who are, we've had several, who are juniors at this point, who said, I've learned more about teaching young Black kids this summer than I did my previous 3 years in my ed prep program.
Oh, interesting. So the idea is that they come straight out of college into teaching. So
They're
so
doing
basically,
it as they matriculate through high school and college. So imagine a sophomore in high school, a sophomore in college. They're teaching first, second, and third graders, almost student teaching, but while you're in high school, and you can be a freshman in college and do it, right? And so
right.
it's like you're doing that and being coached, mentored, supported, but you're also lifting as you climb. You're teaching first, second, and third graders
Understood.
to give you a taste of it beforehand.
Right. But you're not making colleges of education you must pass go, you must go through them in order to enter the classroom. So that's interesting to me. I mean,
Yeah.
that's an example of the schools of education are a central problem. They don't get enough attention, but the onus is on us, because this is what I always try to think about, because I can't just criticize. What am I putting forth as the empowering alternative? And I don't yet have the answer to that question, but maybe that's an area that we should all put our heads together on.
I think education leaders, and we need to wrap soon, but I will say this, and I want to give you an opportunity. Anything else that we didn't cover that we should have, you have an open invitation to come back. So as you produce new things in the world, you will be our critical friend of like being able to like, we can
And if
have
you
these
want,
discussions.
before you publish it, you might, feel
That's
free
true.
to.
Yeah, that's true. You can send it to us before you publish it. That would be helpful too. Also, but I do want to say there is a discussion that we could be having that is not as crazy controversial as all these others, but is entirely essential and necessary for us to engage the public around the mechanics of what a good education is and why we don't have one right now.
Yep.
And I feel like we are being derelict in drifting into so many topical areas that have nothing to do with producing great students and great graduates through a system that, whether we think the system is corrupt or we think it's just needing some tweaks, whatever we think, we need to engage the public around serious ideas.
Yep.
Serious ideas about what it takes to get a great education. And we're not doing that right now. My own kind of admission here is I am so flustered with my people that I used to agree with on school choice and on education policy and whatnot because of this detour into racial politics and into things like education censorship laws or top-down state-sponsored laws that remove books. And no one's saying anything about the fact that Ruby Bridges' books being removed from a school is actually a problem. Like, this is all stuff we're suffering this in silence right now, which to me is so alarming that it makes me want to give up on the whole movement, like end all my friendships. Because if smart and intelligent people are this unserious at this moment and this politically motivated, I don't know what to do with it, because I actually place a premium on smart people. I place a premium on smart people not dumbing themselves down and acting dumb and sitting at tables with people that are complete racial charlatans, right? When we talk about a bipartisan, tripartisan, nonpartisan agenda for America on education to get all kids up and lift all boats, that's going to have to come with a serious and sober conversation that hasn't been had, I think, in 10 years. Like 10 years ago, there were serious people sitting around together working on that, and they're gone now.
Yeah. Well, I share many of those sentiments. I'm certainly not a fan of many of the, and I've talked about it publicly, just these ideas of banning this and banning that. That is not typically the way we win. The way you fight bad ideas is frankly with better ideas. And I try to take that onus. I try to take that responsibility and say, okay, well, what am I putting forth? And the more in which we can engage in that kind of discussion. I mean, you guys, again, you just mentioned you were in Chicago. I just heard the new mayor of Chicago. I don't know if you saw that clip that he did where I guess he was talking about when he was a teacher, and he was saying because of where he thought his kids were, he never gave a failing grade. He never assigned homework.
Don't start me on the homework thing.
Don't start me either.
Wait, which way?
I'm for homework.
Yeah.
I'm not, and I'm not. I'm a parent of 3 kids upstairs right now, and I'm so sick of y'all with your worksheets. Me and Sharif go back and forth about this. We go back and forth. He's an educator. I'm a parent.
I could be anti-worksheet and still be very pro homework.
Exactly.
Well, okay, yeah, okay. Then now you got me interested.
Okay,
a little
all
more
right,
on
Sharif.
this. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
Sharif.
yeah.
So here's where you and I don our educator hat. Homework is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely.
Homework
critical.
is crucial, man. You got to have checks for understanding.
And talking about competitive, everybody's talking about we want to be globally competitive. I will tell you, the folks from Iran, Africa, Asia, they're going to kick your little soft, not want to do homework, not want to be stressed, they're going to run circles around you. Like that's what I'm just sitting there like, you know what? This is fascinating. All the you know, I don't want to do homework. I don't want to work here. I don't want to, like, we see it in the workplace. Oh, there's like all this fragility, man.
Right. And the reason I raised it, wasn't just coming from anybody. This was coming from the new mayor of Chicago. You know, it's just like, that's not what we need right now. That's not what we need right now. And so I'm with you to forge a new discussion around the factors that actually drive student learning and improve teaching. Let's do it.
There's got to be an education science believing centrist adult table, so that when the fringes and the flanks, the mayor of Chicago goes one direction. I'm having kind of like fights in all directions right now. So like my leftists who believe that all data is bad, and and testing is a tool of the devil and all that type of stuff.
Nobody's failing if you don't assess it. So
nobody's failing. You just don't assess them. Yeah, all that me.
We can get rid of all the gaps, any type of gap. Just stop looking at it. Like
that's the best way. Yeah. I can close the achieve gap tomorrow. Let's just erase the data that shows
correct.
It, right?
There it is.
All right. Well, listen, Ian Rowe, thank you so much for coming on today. Any final words? Any way for people to find your work, or that what you would want to point them to? We'll give you that time now, and you do have an open invitation to come back. But so this isn't your final word.
Yes. No. Yeah. Well, first of all, no. The most important thing is we're all in this together. At the end of the day, we care about outcomes for our kids. Again, we may have different strategies. I found a lot more overlap in this conversation, and we just need to do this more and be serious about it. Sometimes the social media and all these other tools put us into boxes and 140 character limits or whatever the Twitter feed is these days, where we lose the nuance, we lose the humanity. So to the degree that you, I, the three of us, the more of us who care about these issues can come together and talk about, again, the factors that actually matter. That's why I wrote my book. Like, in my view, F.R.E.E., this framework of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship is not just throwaway. We can talk about that next time. I think are the tools of human flourishing for our community. And I just love the opportunity to speak about it, and let's do it some more.
We are going to do it more. And we need to even think about having a meeting around doing it more and getting some of these, like Sharif is a great connector in that he transverses many different rooms where intelligent scholars and people are talking about the real issues in education. And it would be important to bring something together at some point. I will say this much to you. I did give you this credit before on a previous show, even as I was violently disagreeing with you on some things. I have my own concept around the 3 R's that I talked to you about a couple years ago, and have been in process of writing a parenting book about the rights, the responsibilities, and the role of parents. And when I talked to you a couple years ago, and you said, yeah, there's a 4th R, and that's results. I added the 4th R. I gave you credit for it, and I said it in one of my shows, like, okay, the 3 R's are now 4 R's of parenting, and have been working out that framework. So even as we can disagree with each other and iron sharpens iron or whatnot, you still learn from your 100%. Interactions with each other and add. So that's what we should be doing for the work. Thank you so much for being so gracious to come on today. We appreciate you.
Thank you, guys. I love it. All right. Peace.
Peace. Thank you for all of you that have watched the show today and the ones that are going to share it tomorrow. And we know what always happens. You do a very good job of making sure that others get to see it and watch it. We thank you so much, as always. And wherever you watch the show, please click on it, share it, and subscribe if you can, leave us a review of the show and let us know what we got right and what we didn't get right. We're always here for feedback. This has been another episode of the 8 Black Hands. I'm sorry, the 8 Black Hands. This has been another episode of Freedom Friday. See, I don't know which hat I'm wearing on which days. Freedom Friday. And you are still not free, but hopefully you're freer at the end of this hour than you were when we began. Thank you so much. And we